Hi, grade 6. So for today's lesson, what I wanted to talk about is this idea of adding critical details to your writing to make it more interesting for the reader. We talked about this a little bit when we did narrative stories earlier in the year, but I just wanted to emphasize with today's lesson that adding critical details and interesting information, descriptive language, all of those things are also important in expository writing. So things like essays and even journal entries, which you guys have been doing. So a lot of adding critical details is about answering these two questions that I have up on the screen. So number one, what does it look like? And number two, why is it important? And I'm going to explain these two questions a little bit more in just a second. But what I wanted to do first is I just wanted to demonstrate the difference that adding details can make for a passage. So let's start with this first passage about lighthouses. Lighthouses are built to warn sailors about dangerous rocks. They use lights as a warning. Some use loud foghorns to warn ships. Lighthouses used to all have a lighthouse keeper. Nowadays, lighthouses often work automatically. Okay, so they're giving you information. It's technically grammatically correct, although it sounds a little bit choppy. But the main thing that's wrong with this passage is just honestly that it's a little bit boring, right? Because there's no real detail added. They're just listing a whole bunch of facts. So what we want to do is we want to start thinking about what details we can add that the reader is going to be interested in. So let's look at a second version of this passage. Tall lighthouses are built to warn sailors about really dangerous rocks. They use strong yellow and red lights as a warning. Some use very loud horns called foghorns to warn sailing ships. Old lighthouses used to all have a lighthouse keeper. Nowadays, new lighthouses often work automatically. Okay, so this passage is a little bit better than the first one because we've added some descriptive language, but I would still say that it's not really the most interesting passage to read. So just remember, when you're adding detail, it's not just about kind of sprinkling some descriptive language throughout, saying really dangerous instead of just dangerous. That helps, but it's not going to solve the main problem with the passage, which is that when I'm reading it, it just kind of reads as a whole bunch of information that's listed. I'm not really picturing much as the reader as I read through it. So let's look at a third version of this passage that not only just adds a few descriptive words here and there, but actually changes the sentences and adds whole phrases that make things much more descriptive and makes it much more easy. Kind of easy for the reader to visualize what's going on. So tall, sturdy lighthouses are built along the shore to warn sailors about huge ledges of treacherous, craggy stone hidden beneath rough waters. Powerful yellow and red lights blink and flash warnings, marking the dangerous places for ships to avoid. Some use very loud, low-pitched sirens called foghorns to warn sailing ships who cannot see through thick fog hanging over the water. Lighthouses built before the age of electricity used to require a lighthouse keeper to fill the lamps with oil and keep the lenses clean and free of ice. Nowadays, modern lighthouses use sophisticated technology to work automatically. So again, we haven't just sort of sprinkled some descriptive words throughout like we did with the second version. In this passage, we've actually rewritten and added quite a bit. So phrases like huge ledges of treacherous, craggy stone hidden beneath rough waters, or something like through thick fog hanging over the water. We can actually start to picture the scene that this is taking place in, right? It's not a narrative story, but when we're talking about lighthouses, we still want the reader to be able to picture this lighthouse at work, right? So using phrases like that just add a little bit more interest for the reader. Okay, so again, this is just designed to kind of show you how much of a difference adding some descriptive words and descriptive phrases can make, right? Because when you compare this passage to that first one that we read through, right, there's a pretty huge difference between them. So again, we want to make sure that we are adding those descriptive words. Okay, so for today's activity, again, we're going to be focusing on answering these two questions. So I like to call them detail generating questions. The first one is, what does it look like, or sound like, feel like, taste like, smell like? Basically, I'm talking about the 5 senses here. And then the second question is, why is it important? Why is this detail that you're adding important to whatever the main idea of your essay is or your paragraph is? So let's look at some examples of what I'm going to have you do in today's activity. So basically, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you take sentences like this, hiking boots are useful, and you're going to be answering these two questions. What does it look like, and why is it important? In order to add some detail. So hiking boots are useful. So instead of saying hiking boots, I'm going to describe what they look like and maybe what they feel like. So sturdy, ankle-high boots with solid foot support. So I've added some description because I'm kind of using the 5 senses. So in this case, I'm using sight and I'm using what something feels like, solid foot support, in order to add that detail. And then the second question, of course, is why is it important? So why are hiking boots important? Because they help prevent injuries when hiking. Okay, so I've added more detail to that sentence by answering these 2 questions. Let's try another example. Cell phones can be important. So in this case, we're going to be describing what cell phone, a little more detail about the cell phone, what it looks like, what it can do. And then instead of just saying it's important, we're actually going to explain why cell phones are important. So a reliable, high-quality cell phone with email and lots of apps can be critical in an emergency situation. So again, I've described the actual cell phone in a little bit more detail, explained that it can have email and lots of apps, and then I mentioned why it's actually important. It can be critical in an emergency situation, right? If you're lost, you might be able to use something like Google Maps to help you get out of that situation. So these are the kind of details that we want to add to these really simple sentences in order to make them better. So in the form or in the Google Doc that I give you for today's assignment, you're basically going to be doing exactly what I've done here in these first 2 examples. You're going to be taking a really short, uninteresting and basic sentence, and you're going to be answering these 2 detail generating questions. What does it look like? Why is it important? You're going to answer them in order to create a longer, better sentence. So the only thing that I want you to write is a new version of that sentence. And you're going to do that by answering these 2 questions. If you have any example or any questions about today's activity, you can send me a private message, or you can schedule a one-on-one Google Meet with me at any time during the day, okay? All right, guys, good luck and have a good day.